What happens when you give absolute power to people who probably shouldn't be trusted with a butter knife, let alone a crown? You get centuries of spectacular royal disasters that make reality television look like a documentary on proper etiquette. Welcome to the most gloriously catastrophic collection of crowned incompetence in human history. Before we dive into this royal train wreck, make sure you hit that subscribe button because trust me, you're going to want to see where this absurd journey takes us. And while you're settling in for this wild ride, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Are you tucked in bed at midnight questioning how these people ever ruled empires? Or are you procrastinating at work, pretending this is educational content? Either way, you're in excellent company. Tonight, we're counting down the 20 most spectacularly unfit royals who somehow managed to stumble their way onto thrones across British history. These aren't just your garden variety bad kings and queens. These are the monarchs who turned ruling into an art form of disaster. We're talking about royals who lost entire countries over personal grudges, who bankrupted kingdoms for interior decorating projects, and who made decisions so baffling that historians are still scratching their heads centuries later. Starting with a bonus, number 21 brings us to Princess Margaret, the royal family's original party girl, who treated taxpayer money like confetti at her own personal celebration. Born in 1930 as the spare to her sister's heir, Margaret spent her entire life proving that being second in line to the throne didn't mean settling for second-rate luxury. She was glamorous in ways that most British royals could never dream of achieving, but her definition of royal duty was essentially turning every day into an expensive photo shoot. Margaret didn't just enjoy the finer things in life, she weaponized them. Her most infamous project was a private villa on the Caribbean island of Mustique, which she transformed into what can only be described as a taxpayer-funded playground for socialites. She spent £60,000 in mid-20th century money renovating this tropical palace, including a bathroom that cost £6,000 and featured hand-painted tiles, gold fixtures, and a bathtub so large it could have legally qualified as a small swimming pool. But the Caribbean extravagance was just the beginning. Back in London, Margaret tore through royal allowances like a tornado through a furniture store, redecorating her Kensington Palace apartments with the enthusiasm of someone on an unlimited shopping spree. Antique mirrors appeared overnight, silk wallpaper covered every surface, and custom chandeliers materialized as if by magic. Each expense was carefully filed under the category of royal duty, a term Margaret interpreted to mean creating the perfect aesthetic for her lifestyle. Her approach to actual royal responsibilities was equally creative. Margaret attended functions when the mood struck her, delivered speeches when they amused her, and generally treated royal protocol like a suggestion box she could ignore at will. She was notorious for keeping entire delegations of Commonwealth leaders waiting because her hairdresser was running behind schedule. When confronted about these delays, she reportedly responded with nothing more than a shrug and the lighting of another cigarette. The woman chain-smoked her way through decades of public appearances, treating state dinners like cocktail parties and official ceremonies like fashion shows. Her marriage to photographer Anthony Armstrong-Jones began with tabloid euphoria, but quickly descended into a bitter spectacle of public arguments, separate vacations, and icy silences that could freeze champagne. Their divorce in 1978 marked the first royal divorce in nearly a century, cementing Margaret's position as the monarchy's reigning icon of modern scandal. Through it all, Margaret never apologized. She never explained herself. She never attempted to justify the enormous cost of her lifestyle to a public that was funding it. She once declared that she had never suffered from the disease of trying to be popular, which might have been admirable if it hadn't cost British taxpayers millions of pounds over the decades. Moving up our countdown to number 20, we encounter King John, also known as John Lackland, a monarch whose reign was such a comprehensive disaster that he managed to lose the actual crown jewels in a swamp. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally in a muddy, tide-swept estuary, where they presumably remain buried to this day, waiting for some bewildered metal detector enthusiast to stumble upon the ultimate archaeological jackpot. John earned his nickname Lackland because he possessed a truly remarkable talent for losing things: territory, allies, respect, and eventually the physical symbols of his monarchy. By the time of his final military campaign in 1216, John wasn't so much ruling England as he was frantically trying to keep it from falling apart in his hands like a poorly constructed sandwich. The crown jewels disaster unfolded during one of John's many desperate retreats from hostile territory. Facing rebellion from his own nobles, invasion from French forces, and excommunication from the Pope, John decided to split his travelling party while crossing the treacherous waters of the Wash in eastern England. He took the safer land route while sending his slower wagons, laden with royal treasure, across the dangerous tidal flats. The Wash is notorious for its rapidly changing tides, shifting sands, and the kind of terrain that makes experienced travellers nervous. John's convoy attempted to beat the rising waters but misjudged the timing catastrophically. The tide swept in faster than expected. Horses panicked, wagons overturned, and somewhere beneath the churning salt water and sucking mud, the crown jewels of England simply vanished. There was no dramatic rescue mission, no frantic recovery effort. The royal treasure was gone, swallowed by the sea like a cosmic punchline to John's already ridiculous reign. The king who had spent years losing pieces of his kingdom had finally managed to lose the crown itself, quite literally buried beneath the waves of his own incompetence. But this wasn't even John's first spectacular failure. Before misplacing his monarchy in a puddle, he had already managed to lose Normandy to the French, alienate most of his court through erratic taxation and paranoid governance, and earn the lasting enmity of his nobles by treating royal authority like his personal plaything. His reign was such a comprehensive disaster that even after his death, chroniclers seemed reluctant to praise anything about him except the fact that he was finally gone. Our journey continues with number 19, Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, who decided that pilot training was optional when it came to flying military aircraft. In what can only be described as peak royal confidence meeting basic physics, Henry climbed into a plane without a license, took off without authorization, and promptly demonstrated why aviation requires more than aristocratic breeding and good intentions. Born in 1900 as the third son of King George V, Henry was destined for a military career that was supposed to teach him discipline, humility, and perhaps most importantly, respect for proper procedures. Unfortunately, the training didn't quite take. Henry developed a fascination with the emerging world of aviation, which was perfectly respectable for a royal in the 1920s and 30s, when aircraft represented the cutting edge of modern technology and masculine adventure. The problem was Henry's approach to learning this new skill. Instead of enrolling in flight school, logging training hours, or consulting with experienced pilots, he apparently decided that royal privilege extended to the laws of aerodynamics. One afternoon, displaying the kind of confidence that can only come from a lifetime of having other people solve your problems, Henry approached a military aircraft parked at a base, climbed into the cockpit, and attempted to take off without informing anyone of his intentions. What followed was a masterclass in why aviation manuals exist. Henry managed to get the aircraft airborne, which was probably more than anyone expected, but maintaining controlled flight proved to be beyond his improvised skill set. The plane wobbled, dipped, and eventually crash-landed in a nearby field with all the grace of a dropped piano. Miraculously, Henry survived the impact with nothing more than wounded pride and a newfound respect for the complexity of flight. The aircraft, however, was significantly less fortunate. The military personnel who came running to investigate the sudden appearance of a crashed plane in their vicinity were presumably surprised to discover a member of the royal family emerging from the wreckage like some sort of aristocratic crop circle. The incident was handled with the kind of diplomatic silence that only British institutions can manage. No court-martial, no public investigation, no detailed incident report. The official records seem to have developed a convenient case of amnesia regarding the exact circumstances of how a royal prince managed to fall out of the sky during peacetime. Henry did eventually earn a legitimate pilot's license, though his instructors likely watched his every move with the intensity of air traffic controllers during a thunderstorm. His later military career proceeded without further aerial disasters, filled with the kind of ceremonial duties designed to keep royals visible, but safely away from anything requiring split-second decision-making or advanced technical knowledge. As we continue our countdown of royal disasters, each story reveals the same fundamental truth about absolute power and inherited privilege. When consequences are optional and preparation is something other people worry about, even the simplest tasks can become spectacular failures that echo through history. The pattern becomes clear when you realize that these royals weren't just making individual mistakes. They were operating within a system that actively rewarded incompetence as long as it came wrapped in ermine and accompanied by the right bloodline. Which brings us to number 18, King Richard II, a monarch who thought his horse needed better accessories than most people's wedding attire. Richard wasn't content with merely looking regal himself. He believed that true divine kingship required his entire entourage to reflect his celestial status, including his four-legged transportation. While England struggled with economic upheaval and social unrest following the Black Death, Richard commissioned golden outfits for his favourite steed, complete with jewelled bridles and velvet trappings that cost more than most villages saw in a decade. Born in 1367 and crowned at age 10, Richard developed an early obsession with the visual aspects of monarchy that would define his entire reign. He didn't want to govern England so much as he wanted to star in it, treating the kingdom like an elaborate stage production where he was both director and lead actor. Every public appearance became a carefully choreographed performance designed to reinforce his belief that he was literally chosen by God to rule over lesser mortals. The horse costumes were just the beginning of Richard's aesthetic madness. He redesigned royal ceremonies to be more theatrical, commissioned portraits that depicted him with an actual halo, and insisted that courtiers follow elaborate dress codes that changed with his moods. His personal wardrobe budget could have funded small armies, but Richard saw these expenditures as religious obligations rather than vanity projects. This wasn't mere indulgence. Richard genuinely believed that the visual splendor of monarchy was inseparable from its divine authority. In his mind, a plainly dressed king was a contradiction in terms, and a king with a poorly accessorized horse was practically blasphemy. He spent vast sums on fabric, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that served no practical purpose beyond making him feel godlike. The irony was that while Richard obsessed over appearances, his actual grip on power grew increasingly tenuous. His heavy taxation to fund these theatrical displays alienated the nobility. His arbitrary rule sparked multiple rebellions, and his complete disconnection from practical governance made him vulnerable to anyone who actually understood how kingdoms functioned. When Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile in 1399, he found a kingdom ruled by a man more interested in costume fittings than statecraft. Richard's deposition was swift and almost anticlimactic. The king who had spent decades perfecting his divine image was quietly escorted from power like a failed actor being removed from the stage. Number 17 takes us even further back in time to encounter King John's older brother, Richard I, better known as Richard the Lionheart. While history often portrays him as a heroic crusader king, the reality was far more absurd. Richard spent exactly 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England, treating his kingdom like an ATM that occasionally required his personal signature. Richard's approach to kingship was refreshingly honest in its selfishness. He saw England not as a realm to govern but as a resource to exploit for his military adventures in the Holy Land, He sold offices, castles, and entire counties to raise funds for his crusading expeditions, reportedly declaring that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer wealthy enough to afford it. The king's absence created a power vacuum that his younger brother John eagerly attempted to fill, leading to years of civil conflict while Richard was off playing soldier in Palestine. Meanwhile, the actual business of running England fell to a series of regents and administrators who struggled to maintain order, while their absentee monarch burned through the royal treasury on foreign battlefields. Richard's military reputation, while formidable, came at an enormous cost to his subjects. His crusading expenses bankrupted the kingdom. His ransom, after being captured on his way home, cost England another fortune, and his brief returns were focused entirely on extracting more money for his next military adventure. He treated England like a medieval crowdfunding platform for his personal holy war. When Richard finally died in 1199 from an infected crossbow wound while besieging a minor French castle, he left behind a kingdom that had been systematically stripped of resources to fund his decade-long absence. The Lionheart's legacy was essentially that of a very expensive tourist who happened to wear a crown. Moving forward to number 16, we encounter the delightfully unhinged King George III, who once held a lengthy diplomatic conversation with an oak tree because he believed it was the King of Prussia. This wasn't a one-time episode of royal eccentricity. George's mental health deteriorated over decades, turning the British monarchy into an unpredictable theatre of confusion that somehow managed to lose the American colonies while gaining a reputation for botanical diplomacy. George began his reign in 1760 as an earnest, bookish young king determined to restore moral authority to the monarchy. Unlike his hedonistic predecessors, he was faithful to his wife, interested in agriculture, and genuinely concerned about governing properly. Unfortunately, his brain had other plans entirely. The symptoms started gradually with periods of rapid speech, sleepless nights, and increasingly erratic behaviour during court functions. George would launch into rambling monologues that jumped between subjects without any logical connection, repeat phrases obsessively, and experience wild mood swings that left his courtiers walking on eggshells around their increasingly unpredictable monarch. The famous tree incident occurred during one of his most severe episodes, when George was observed walking through the gardens at Kew Palace, deep in animated conversation with a large oak. According to witnesses, he bowed politely to the tree, gestured diplomatically, and appeared to be conducting serious negotiations with what he firmly believed was Frederick William III of Prussia. Courtiers watching this surreal scene faced an impossible dilemma. Do you interrupt a king's diplomatic discussion with a tree? Do you play along and pretend the oak is indeed responding? Do you quietly back away and pretend this never happened? The incident became symbolic of George's deteriorating mental state and the impossible position it placed everyone around him. Modern medical experts believe George suffered from acute porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that can cause symptoms ranging from severe abdominal pain to hallucinations and dramatic personality changes. The treatments available at the time, including bloodletting, cold baths, and restraints, likely made his condition worse rather than better. By 1811, George's condition had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer function as king. Parliament passed the Regency Act, transferring power to his son, the future George IV. The mad king spent his final years blind, deaf, and largely unaware of the world around him, a tragic end to a reign that had begun with such promise. The cruel irony was that George's madness coincided with some of the most crucial events in British history, including the loss of the American colonies and the Napoleonic Wars. While Britain navigated these monumental challenges, their king was having tea parties with furniture and conducting international relations with the royal gardens. Our countdown continues with number 15, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, whose approach to public relations makes a flaming dumpster look like a masterclass in crisis management. Andrew somehow managed to turn a simple television interview into one of the most catastrophic pieces of damage control in modern royal history, creating a disaster so spectacular that media studies programs now use it as an example of how not to handle a scandal. The Duke of York had spent decades cultivating an image as the dashing helicopter pilot and Falklands War veteran, the Queen's allegedly favourite son who jetted around the world on various royal duties. But beneath the polished exterior lurked a man whose judgment in personal relationships would eventually detonate his entire public life, like a poorly timed firework in a crowded theatre. When allegations surfaced connecting Andrew to convicted financier Jeffrey Epstein, the logical response might have been dignified silence, careful legal counsel, or at minimum a brief statement expressing concern for victims. Instead, Andrew chose the nuclear option. He agreed to a sit-down interview with BBC Newsnight, apparently believing he could charm his way out of one of the most toxic scandals of the modern era. What followed was 60 minutes of television so awkward it made viewers physically uncomfortable. Andrew claimed he couldn't have been at a nightclub where he was allegedly seen because he was at a Pizza Express in Woking that evening. This oddly specific alibi struck many as the kind of detail someone might invent on the spot, like claiming you couldn't have robbed a bank because you were busy reorganizing your sock drawer. Then came the sweating controversy. When faced with descriptions of his alleged perspiration during encounters, Andrew deployed what can only be described as the most bizarre medical defense in royal history. He claimed that an adrenaline overdose during the Falklands War had temporarily destroyed his ability to sweat, a condition that had apparently resolved itself by the time of the interview, when he was visibly nervous under studio lights. The scientific plausibility of this explanation was questionable at best, but the real problem was Andrew's demeanour throughout the interview. He appeared smug, detached, and occasionally bored, as if discussing serious criminal allegations was merely an inconvenient interruption to his afternoon schedule. There was no visible remorse, no acknowledgement of the severity of the situation, no apparent understanding that his reputation was disintegrating in real time. The public reaction was swift and merciless. Charities began severing ties with Andrew before the interview had finished airing. Military honours were quietly redistributed. Palace officials scrambled to create distance between the Duke and any official royal functions. Even the famously stoic Queen Elizabeth reportedly expressed displeasure at her son's spectacularly tone-deaf performance. Within weeks, Andrew's public career was effectively over. He stepped back from royal duties with the kind of permanent finality usually reserved for abdications or deaths. The man who had once been third in line to the throne found himself relegated to the royal equivalent of witness protection, visible only at carefully managed family gatherings, where his presence couldn't cause additional damage. Number 14 brings us to the gloriously delusional Edward VIII, who abdicated the throne after 325 days because he decided being king was less appealing than being married to a twice-divorced American socialite. Edward didn't just abandon his constitutional duties. He threw them away like yesterday's newspaper because he found the job description insufficiently romantic for his personal narrative. Born to be king and raised with that expectation, Edward spent his entire adult life treating monarchy like an elaborate costume party, where he was forced to wear an uncomfortable outfit. From his earliest public appearances, he radiated the energy of someone who would rather be literally anywhere else, doing literally anything else, preferably while being photographed looking brooding and misunderstood. As Prince of Wales, Edward perfected the art of appearing busy while accomplishing nothing measurable. He attended ceremonial functions with the enthusiasm of someone enduring root canal surgery, delivered speeches that sounded like he was reading grocery lists, and generally approached royal duty with all the passion of a tax accountant reviewing expense reports. The abdication crisis of 1936 wasn't really about love conquering duty. It was about a man who had spent decades looking for an excuse to quit a job he never wanted, and Wallace Simpson provided the perfect dramatic justification. Edward could abandon his responsibilities while framing the decision as a grand romantic gesture rather than what it actually was. An elaborate resignation letter wrapped in fairy tale language. His radio address to the nation was a masterpiece of self-serving theatre. Edward claimed he couldn't carry the burden of kingship without the support of the woman he loved, conveniently ignoring that Wallace had already fled to France to avoid the media circus, and seemed considerably less enthusiastic about the whole affair than he was. After the abdication, Edward became the Duke of Windsor and spent the rest of his life in a kind of gilded exile, floating between expensive hotels and borrowed villas, while nursing grievances about not being treated with sufficient reverence. He resented that his younger brother George became king, resented that Wallace was never accepted by the royal family, and seemed genuinely surprised that abandoning the British Empire had consequences for his social standing. The couple's later years were spent in a curious mixture of luxury and irrelevance, attending dinner parties and charity galas, while Edward occasionally made public statements that reminded everyone why his abdication had been such a relief. They became professional former royals, living museum pieces of a constitutional crisis that Britain had ultimately survived quite well without them. Number 13 takes us back to the medieval period to meet King Stephen, who managed to turn a straightforward succession into 19 years of civil war, known as the Anarchy. Stephen's approach to claiming the throne was like trying to solve a jigsaw puzzle by hitting it with a hammer while blindfolded during an earthquake. When Henry I died in 1135, he had spent years establishing his daughter Matilda as his heir, extracting oaths of loyalty from his nobles, and creating what should have been a smooth transition of power. Stephen, Henry's nephew, looked at these careful arrangements and decided they were merely suggestions that didn't apply to someone with his particular combination of ambition and poor judgment. Stephen's claim to the throne was based primarily on his ability to reach London faster than Matilda and his willingness to promise anything to anyone who might support him. He wasn't necessarily the rightful heir, but he was certainly the most available heir, and in medieval politics, possession was often 9/10 of the law. The problem was that Stephen had the political instincts of a concussed goldfish. He alienated allies through broken promises, failed to secure his borders, and generally governed as if he was playing a board game where the rules changed depending on his mood. His reign became a masterclass in how to take a functioning kingdom and accidentally dismantle it through sheer incompetence. The civil war that followed wasn't a dramatic clash of ideologies or competing visions for England's future. It was essentially 19 years of expensive confusion as various nobles switched sides, formed temporary alliances, and generally treated the kingdom like a medieval fantasy football league, where loyalty was determined by whoever offered the best compensation package. Stephen spent nearly 2 decades fighting for a crown he had essentially stolen, only to eventually agree that Matilda's son Henry should inherit the throne after his death. The entire conflict had been a pointless exercise in royal stubbornness that devastated England's economy, weakened its military, and created a generation of nobles who learned that royal authority was negotiable if you had enough armed supporters. Moving to number 12, we encounter the spectacularly vindictive Mary I, better known as Bloody Mary, who decided that the best way to restore Catholicism to England was through an enthusiastic program of public executions that made her subjects nostalgic for the good old days, when religious persecution was at least more efficient. Mary's approach to religious reform was like trying to change someone's mind about their favourite restaurant by burning down every other establishment in town. Over the course of her 5-year reign, she had approximately 300 Protestant reformers burned at the stake, creating a public relations disaster that haunted English Catholicism for centuries. The irony was that Mary genuinely believed she was saving souls through these executions. In her mind, burning heretics was an act of spiritual mercy that would purify England and restore it to proper Catholic orthodoxy. She approached religious persecution with the methodical enthusiasm of someone organising a charity drive, complete with careful record-keeping and regular progress reports. The The problem wasn't just the moral horror of mass executions, though that was certainly significant. Mary's methods were also politically catastrophic, creating exactly the opposite effect she intended. Instead of inspiring religious conversion, the burnings turned Protestant martyrs into folk heroes and made Catholicism synonymous with brutal oppression in the English popular imagination. Mary's reign became a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing personal religious conviction with effective governance. She was so focused on theological purity that she completely ignored the practical consequences of her policies, creating a legacy that would make life significantly more difficult for English Catholics long after her death. Number 11 brings us to the wonderfully incompetent King Ethelred the Unready, whose nickname literally means badly advised, and who spent 38 years proving that sometimes the obvious solution is to pay your enemies enormous amounts of money to go away temporarily. Ethelred's strategy for dealing with Viking invasions was essentially medieval extortion management. Instead of building effective defences, training better armies, or developing strategic alliances, he decided that the most efficient approach was to collect massive taxes from his subjects and hand the money directly to Viking raiders, in exchange for promises that they would raid someone else instead. This policy, known as dangold, worked about as well as you might expect. The Vikings took the money, used it to buy better weapons and ships, and returned the following year to demand even larger payments. Ethelred had essentially created a subscription service for Viking raids, guaranteeing regular invasions while funding his enemies' military improvements. The king, who was supposed to protect England from foreign invasion, had instead become its primary financial sponsor. Ethelred's reign turned the kingdom into a medieval protection racket where the supposed protector was actually the one facilitating the threats. When the Vikings eventually decided that collecting tribute was less profitable than simply conquering England outright, Ethelred fled to Normandy, abandoning his kingdom to Sweyn Forkbeard and later Canute. He had spent nearly 4 decades as king and managed to accomplish the impressive feat of making foreign conquest seem like an improvement over native rule. As our countdown continues, each story reveals new depths of royal incompetence that somehow managed to shape the course of British history through sheer spectacular failure. Moving to number 10, we encounter the magnificently deranged Henry VI, a king so spectacularly unsuited for medieval warfare that he once fainted at the sight of his own army and had to be carried off the battlefield like a dropped sack of grain. Henry didn't just lose the 100 Years' War with France. He managed to lose it so thoroughly that historians still marvel at his ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory with the consistency of a broken clock that's wrong twice a day. Born in 1421 and crowned as an infant, Henry inherited kingdoms in both England and France, at a time when military leadership was considered the primary qualification for royal authority. Unfortunately, Henry possessed all the martial instincts of a particularly pacifist librarian. While his nobles expected him to lead cavalry charges and inspire troops through personal courage, Henry preferred prayer, scholarship, and what can only be described as aggressive conflict avoidance. The king's approach to military strategy was to delegate everything to his commanders, while he retreated to his private chambers to contemplate theology and establish educational institutions. This might have worked if Henry had possessed any talent for choosing competent military leaders, but his judgment in personnel matters was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot in a furnace. Henry's mental health began deteriorating in his 20s, manifesting as periods of complete catatonia, where he would stare blankly at walls for hours without speaking or acknowledging anyone around him. During these episodes, the King of England was essentially a well-dressed statue propped up in a throne, while his kingdom descended into civil war around his motionless figure. The Wars of the Roses began partly because Henry was too mentally unstable to prevent his nobles from murdering each other over succession rights. His inability to produce clear leadership created a power vacuum that ambitious relatives filled with increasing violence, turning England into a battlefield. where the prize was the right to govern a king who couldn't govern himself. When Henry briefly recovered from his mental episodes, he would emerge to discover that entire battles had been fought, territories lost, and political alliances completely reshuffled while he had been mentally absent. His attempts to reassert royal authority were like trying to conduct an orchestra after the musicians had already gone home and set the concert hall on fire. Number 9 introduces us to the breathtakingly arrogant James I of England, who was so convinced of his own intellectual superiority that he wrote a book explaining why kings were essentially gods on earth, then spent his reign proving that divine right was no substitute for basic common sense. James arrived from Scotland in 1603, carrying an ego so inflated it required its own royal procession. He had spent years ruling Scotland as an absolute monarch, and assumed that England would gratefully submit to his obviously superior wisdom about everything from theology to tobacco consumption. His first parliamentary session was like watching a university professor lecture a room full of students who had already graduated and were paying his salary. The new king's solution to religious tension was to commission a new translation of the Bible, while simultaneously alienating both Catholics and Puritans through his habit of making pronouncements about divine will as if he had God's personal phone number. The King James Bible became a literary masterpiece, but James himself remained a walking contradiction who preached moral authority while surrounding himself with handsome young courtiers and spending lavishly on court entertainment. James's foreign policy was equally baffling. He pursued peace with Spain while his subjects wanted war, arranged his son's marriage to a Catholic princess while claiming to defend Protestantism, and generally conducted diplomacy as if international relations were a chess game where he was the only player who understood the rules. The king, who claimed divine inspiration, spent most of his reign struggling with Parliament over money, religious policy, and his apparent belief that royal prerogative extended to rewriting the laws of economics. His courtiers learned to navigate his moods like weather patterns, never quite sure whether they would encounter the scholarly theologian or the paranoid autocrat who saw treason in every disagreement. Our countdown continues with number 8, the delightfully unhinged Charles I, who managed to lose his head in the most literal sense possible by treating civil war like an elaborate costume drama where he was both the romantic lead and the director. Charles inherited his father's belief in divine right, but lacked James's political cunning, approaching kingship with all the strategic awareness of someone trying to negotiate a business deal while wearing a blindfold and speaking in riddles. He genuinely believed that looking regal was the same thing as being an effective ruler, which explained why he spent more time posing for portraits than actually governing his increasingly restless kingdom. The king's approach to Parliament was to treat it like an annoying household staff that occasionally needed to be reminded of their proper place in the cosmic hierarchy. When MPs had the audacity to suggest that royal power might have constitutional limits, Charles responded by attempting to arrest them personally, marching into the House of Commons like an angry father confronting teenagers who had violated curfew. Charles's military strategy during the English Civil War was equally theatrical. He conducted the conflict as if it were an elaborate pageant designed to demonstrate his natural superiority over common rebels, apparently expecting his enemies to be so awed by his divine majesty that they would voluntarily surrender and apologize for their presumption. Even his execution was turned into a performance. Charles spent his final morning carefully selecting his outfit, practicing his final speech, and generally treating his own beheading like a carefully choreographed finale to the greatest tragedy ever written. He died convinced that history would remember him as a martyred saint rather than a king whose stubbornness had torn his kingdom apart. Number 7 takes us back to meet the wonderfully inadequate Edward II, who thought the most pressing issue facing medieval England was whether his boyfriend had sufficient political authority to execute his enemies without parliamentary oversight. Edward's relationship with Piers Gaveston wasn't just a personal scandal. It was a constitutional crisis wrapped in silk scarves and delivered with the subtlety of a medieval soap opera. The king elevated his favourite from minor nobleman to virtual co-ruler, showering him with titles, lands, and political power, while apparently forgetting that his actual nobles might have opinions about being governed by someone whose primary qualification was looking attractive in royal company. Gaveston, to his credit, possessed enough arrogance for both himself and the king combined. He insulted senior nobles to their faces, flaunted his influence over Edward, and generally behaved like someone who had won the medieval lottery and wanted everyone to know it. His presence at court was like throwing a lit match into a room full of gunpowder while wondering why everyone seemed so agitated. When the barons finally executed Gaveston in 1312, Edward's response was to find new favourites who were somehow even more unpopular than the original. The Despencer brothers, Hugh the Elder and Hugh the Younger, managed to make Gaveston look like a model of diplomatic restraint by comparison, alienating what remained of Edward's support through their systematic looting of royal resources. Edward's reign became a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing personal relationships with political appointments. He governed England like someone playing favourites at a dinner party, apparently unaware that kingdoms require slightly more strategic thinking than seating arrangements. Moving to number 6, we encounter the spectacularly absent Richard I, also known as Richard the Lionheart, who spent approximately 6 months of his 10-year reign actually in England. Treating his kingdom like a medieval ATM that occasionally required his personal signature for major withdrawals, Richard's approach to kingship was refreshingly honest in its selfishness. He saw England not as a realm to govern, but as a convenient source of funding for his military adventures in the Holy Land. He sold offices, castles, and entire counties to raise money for his crusading expeditions, reportedly joking that he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer wealthy enough to afford the asking price. The king's absence created a power vacuum that his younger brother John eagerly attempted to fill, leading to years of civil conflict while Richard was busy playing soldier in Palestine. Meanwhile, the actual business of governing England fell to a series of regents and administrators who struggled to maintain order while their absentee monarch burned through the royal treasury on foreign battlefields. Richard's military reputation, while formidable, came at an enormous cost to his English subjects. His crusading expenses bankrupted the kingdom. His ransom after being captured during his return journey cost England another fortune, and his brief visits home were focused entirely on extracting additional funds for his next holy war. When Richard finally died in 1199 from an infected crossbow wound sustained while besieging a minor French castle over a disputed treasure, he left behind a kingdom that had been systematically stripped of resources to fund his decade-long absence. The Lionheart's legacy was essentially that of a very expensive tourist who happened to wear a crown. Number 5 brings us to the gloriously incompetent King Stephen, whose solution to a succession dispute was to turn England into a 19-year-long civil war that historians diplomatically refer to as the anarchy, though medieval chaos theory might be more accurate. Stephen's claim to the throne was based primarily on his ability to reach London faster than the legitimate heir and his willingness to promise absolutely anything to anyone who might support his cause. He wasn't necessarily the rightful king, but he was certainly the most available king, and in medieval politics, possession was often 9/10 of royal law. The problem was that Stephen possessed the political instincts of a caffeinated squirrel. He made promises he couldn't keep, broke alliances he needed to maintain, and generally governed as if the kingdom was a medieval board game, where the rules changed based on his emotional state at any given moment. The civil war that followed wasn't a dramatic clash of competing ideologies or visions for England's future. It was essentially 19 years of expensive confusion, as various nobles switched sides based on whoever offered the most attractive compensation package, treating royal loyalty like a medieval free agency system. Stephen spent nearly 2 decades fighting to keep a crown he had questionably acquired, only to eventually agree that his rival's son should inherit the throne after his death. The entire conflict had been a pointless exercise in royal stubbornness that devastated England's economy, weakened its military, and created a generation of nobles who learned that royal authority was essentially negotiable if you had enough armed supporters. Our journey continues with number 4, the magnificently vindictive Mary I, better known as Bloody Mary, who decided that the most effective way to restore Catholicism to England was through an enthusiastic program of public executions that made religious conversion look like a life or death decision, which it literally was. Mary's approach to theological reform was like trying to change someone's restaurant preferences by systematically poisoning every other establishment in town. Over 5 years, she orchestrated the burning of approximately 300 Protestant reformers, creating a public relations catastrophe that haunted English Catholicism for centuries and turned martyrdom into the era's most popular form of religious testimony. The tragedy was that Mary genuinely believed she was saving souls through these executions. In her mind, burning heretics was an act of spiritual mercy that would purify England and restore proper Catholic orthodoxy to a kingdom that had strayed from the true faith. She approached religious persecution with the methodical enthusiasm of someone organizing a charity fundraiser, complete with detailed record-keeping and regular progress reports to Rome. Mary's methods were not just morally horrifying, but also politically catastrophic, achieving exactly the opposite of her intended goals. Instead of inspiring religious conversion, the burnings transformed Protestant victims into folk heroes and made Catholicism synonymous with brutal oppression in the English popular imagination for generations. The Queen, who wanted to be remembered as the restorer of England's faith, instead became a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing personal religious conviction with effective governance. She was so focused on theological purity that she completely ignored the practical consequences of her policies, creating a legacy that made life significantly more difficult for English Catholics long after her death. Number 3 introduces us to the wonderfully misguided Ethelred the Unready, whose nickname literally translates to badly advised, and who spent 38 years proving that sometimes the most expensive solution is also the least effective one. Ethelred's strategy for dealing with Viking invasions was essentially medieval subscription-based protection services. Instead of building stronger defenses, training more effective armies, or developing strategic alliances with neighboring kingdoms, he decided the most efficient approach was to collect massive taxes from his subjects and hand the money directly to Viking raiders in exchange for temporary promises to raid someone else's territory. This policy, known as Danegeld, worked exactly as well as paying blackmail typically does. The Vikings accepted the money, invested it in better weapons and larger fleets, then returned the following year demanding even higher payments. Ethelred had essentially created a military-industrial complex, where he was simultaneously the victim and the primary financial sponsor. The king who was supposed to protect England from foreign invasion had instead become the Vikings' most reliable source of funding. His reign transformed the kingdom into a medieval protection racket, where the supposed protector was actually facilitating the very threats he claimed to be defending against. When the Vikings eventually decided that collecting annual tribute was less profitable than simply conquering England outright, Ethelred demonstrated his leadership skills by fleeing to Normandy and abandoning his kingdom to Swine Forkbeard. He had spent nearly 4 decades as king and managed to accomplish the remarkable feat of making foreign occupation seem like an improvement over native governance. As we approach the final stretch of our countdown, each remaining story promises to reveal new depths of royal incompetence that somehow managed to shape British history through sheer spectacular failure. The pattern becomes unmistakable. Give someone unlimited power without requiring any qualifications, and the results will be both predictable and entertaining, at least for anyone not living under their rule. Number 2 brings us to the absolutely deranged Henry VIII, a monarch who decided that the best way to solve his marital problems was to create his own religion, execute 2 wives, and transform English politics into a theological soap opera that would make reality television producers weep with envy. Henry didn't just break the rules, he melted them down, reforged them into a crown-shaped weapon, and used it to bludgeon anyone who suggested that maybe, just maybe, kings shouldn't be allowed to invent new branches of Christianity whenever their personal life became inconvenient. His approach to marriage was like treating the institution of matrimony as a medieval escape room, where the solution always involved either annulment or execution. Born in 1491 as the spare heir, Henry wasn't originally supposed to inherit the throne, which might explain why nobody bothered teaching him the finer points of restraint, compromise, or basic human decency. When his older brother Arthur conveniently died young, Henry found himself thrust into a role that required diplomacy and wisdom, qualities he possessed in roughly the same quantity as a rabid wolverine possesses table manners. The famous 6 Wives weren't just a series of romantic misadventures. They were a systematic demolition of European diplomacy conducted through the medium of increasingly creative divorce proceedings. Henry's first marriage to Catherine of Aragon lasted nearly 20 years until he decided that God must disapprove of the union because it hadn't produced a surviving male heir, a theological interpretation that conveniently ignored basic biology and statistics. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage, Henry's solution was breathtakingly simple. He declared himself the head of the Church of England, dissolved all the monasteries, seized their wealth, and appointed bishops who shared his enlightened views on royal divorce. It was like resolving a parking ticket by purchasing the entire city and rewriting the traffic laws. Anne Boleyn, wife number 2, lasted 3 years before Henry decided she was guilty of adultery, treason, and witchcraft, charges that were about as credible as accusing someone of stealing the moon. Her execution was followed by Henry's marriage to Jane Seymour within 24 hours, because apparently grief requires a very brief mourning period when you're a divinely appointed monarch with commitment issues. Jane actually managed to provide Henry with his long-desired male heir, then died shortly after childbirth, which gave the king an opportunity to mourn by immediately planning his next wedding. Wife number 4, Anne of Cleves, was selected based on a flattering portrait that Henry later claimed was false advertising. The marriage was annulled after 6 months because the king found her insufficiently attractive, proving that even in the 16th century, online dating was fraught with disappointment. Catherine Howard, the 5th Mrs. Henry, was barely 20 when she married the increasingly corpulent and paranoid king. Her youth and vivacity lasted approximately 18 months before Henry had her executed for alleged infidelity, because nothing says royal romance like a relationship that ends with your head being separated from your shoulders. The final wife, Catherine Parr, survived by being intelligent, cautious, and extremely skilled at agreeing with Henry's increasingly erratic opinions about religion, politics, and his own divine magnificence. She essentially treated marriage to Henry like a very dangerous full-time job that required constant performance reviews and absolutely no sick days. By the end of his reign, Henry weighed over 300 pounds, required mechanical assistance to move around his palaces, and ruled through a combination of paranoia, religious mania, and the kind of absolute power that would make dictators throughout history take careful notes. He died in 1547, having transformed England from a Catholic kingdom into a Protestant nation, bankrupted the royal treasury, and established a precedent for royal behaviour that made his successors look practically sane by comparison. Moving to number 1, we encounter the spectacularly delusional Charles II, who genuinely believed his hands possessed magical healing powers and spent decades touching sick people while murmuring prayers, as if royal DNA came equipped with supernatural medical abilities that could cure diseases through the power of divine fingertips. Charles didn't just think he was chosen by God to rule, he thought he was chosen by God to practice medicine without a license, transforming the monarchy into a combination of political institution and mystical healing center. The ceremony of the royal touch became a regular feature of his reign, with hundreds of afflicted subjects lining up to receive the king's allegedly miraculous caress. This wasn't a symbolic gesture or metaphorical blessing. Charles genuinely believed that his touch could cure scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that affected the lymph nodes. He would ceremoniously place his hands on the diseased areas while reciting prayers, then present each patient with a gold coin called an angel, as if divine intervention came with a souvenir shop receipt. The practice attracted enormous crowds and became so popular that Charles had to schedule regular healing sessions like a medieval medical clinic. Over the course of his reign, he reportedly touched more than 100,000 people, turning therapeutic fraud into a full-time royal occupation that somehow enhanced rather than damaged his reputation. The irony was that while Charles was busy curing his subjects through supernatural hand placement, his own health was declining rapidly due to his legendary indulgence in every pleasure the 17th century could provide. He suffered from gout, kidney problems, and various ailments that apparently weren't responsive to his own miraculous touch therapy. And there you have it. 25 centuries of proof that absolute power and basic competence have about as much in common as a fish and a bicycle. From kings who lost crown jewels in swamps to monarchs who held diplomatic conversations with trees, these royal disasters remind us that inherited authority is history's longest-running comedy show, complete with costume changes, dramatic exits, and enough spectacular failures to fill 1,000 Netflix series. Sweet dreams, and remember, at least you're not related to any of these people.